The phone call Freddie Mercury made at 3 a.m. that his father never answered in the 40-year silence that followed. What happens when a son spends 40 years trying to earn his father's approval through music that reaches hundreds of millions of people? Yet the one person whose validation he craves most never says the words he needs to hear. When every stadium filled with 70,000 screaming fans can't replace a single sentence of acknowledgement from the man who raised him. When becoming one of the most celebrated performers in human history still leaves you feeling like the disappointed boy who chose the wrong path. This is the story of Freddie Mercury and Bomi Bulsara, father and son, Parsi accountant and rock star, traditional values and theatrical rebellion, a relationship defined by love that was never in question, but approval that was never quite given. This is the story of a phone call made at 3 in the morning from a hotel room in Munich, a conversation that lasted less than 2 minutes, and the 40-year search for words that would finally make a father say, "I'm proud of you," without qualifications or conditions. This is about the success that conquered the world, but couldn't bridge the gap between what Freddie Mercury became and what Farrokh Bulsara was supposed to be. And this is about the funeral where Bomi Bulsara finally broke his silence. But by then, the person who needed to hear it had been dead for 3 days. Bomi Bulsara was not a cruel man. This is important to understand from the beginning. He loved his son, provided for his family, worked honestly as a cashier for the British Colonial Office in Zanzibar, maintaining the kind of respectable middle-class existence that Parsi immigrants built through discipline and adherence to traditional values. When he sent 7-year-old Farrokh away to boarding school in India, it wasn't rejection, it was investment. The best education, connection to Parsi roots, opportunities Zanzibar couldn't provide. When the family fled to London as refugees in 1964, Bomi worked to rebuild their stability in a foreign country. He expected his children to pursue respectable careers: accounting, medicine, law professions that would secure their place in British society and honor the sacrifices made. He was a man who understood the world in terms of responsibility, propriety, and the kind of success that could be explained to other Parsi families at community gatherings. Rock and roll was not part of that understanding. When young Farrokh showed talent at piano, Bomi supported music lessons. Music as cultivation, as education, as one of many skills a well-rounded person might possess. But music as career, as life's focus, as the thing that would define his son's existence and consume his entire being? That was different. That was gambling the family's refugee status and hard-won stability on something as unstable as entertainment. That was choosing visibility over respectability, theatricality over tradition, a path that led away from everything Bomi understood about how to build a secure life. The first real fracture came when Freddie was in his early 20s. He'd completed art school, not the accounting program Bomi had hoped for, but at least education, at least something practical with graphic design skills that could lead to steady employment. Instead, Freddie was working odd jobs and playing music, living in a flat that Bomi considered beneath the family's standards, dating people Bomi found inappropriate, staying out all night, dressing in ways that drew attention, pursuing this band called Queen that seemed to Bomi like an extension of adolescence, the kind of dream young men chase before settling into real careers. They had a conversation. Freddie came to his parents' home. They'd moved to a modest house in Feltham, maintaining the kind of quiet respectability Bomi valued. Farrokh sat across from his father in the small living room, where Jer served tea and then retreated to give them privacy. Bomi spoke carefully, not with anger, but with concern. He understood that young men need time to explore. He'd been patient while Farrokh found his way. But there came a point when exploration had to end and real life had to begin. Freddie was 24, 25 years old. Time to think about career, about stability, about marriage to a suitable Parsi girl, and building the kind of life that would support a family. This music thing, he'd given it a try, but it wasn't working. The band had released an album that hadn't sold particularly well. They were still playing small venues. There was no money in it, no future. It was time to be realistic. Freddie listened, then said the words that created a divide that would never fully close. Music is my real life. Everything else is just survival until the music works. Bomi didn't shout, didn't issue ultimatums, just looked at his son with an expression Freddie would remember for decades. Disappointment, not anger, which could have been met with anger. Not rejection, which could have been clear and final. Just quiet disappointment that somehow hurt worse than any confrontation would have. The look that said, I raised you better than this. I gave you opportunities, and you're choosing this. They didn't speak for months after that conversation. Jer mediated, carrying messages between father and son who lived in the same city, but might as well have been on different continents. When they finally resumed contact, there was a new formality. Bummy would ask about Freddie's health, his living situation, whether he needed anything. But he wouldn't ask about the music, wouldn't acknowledge the band. Treated Queen like an embarrassing phase they were all waiting for Freddie to outgrow. Even when Bohemian Rhapsody exploded in 1975, when Queen became genuinely famous, when Freddie's face appeared on magazine covers and the band toured internationally, Bummy's response was muted. He was glad Farrokh was earning money, that the financial instability had resolved. But this wasn't the kind of success he'd envisioned. Rock stars weren't respectable. The attention, the costumes, the lifestyle, it was everything Parsi values taught you to avoid. Public spectacle instead of quiet dignity. Theatrical excess instead of modest achievement. And the music itself so loud, so strange, so different from the classical traditions Bomi appreciated. The distance wasn't helped by Freddie's increasing inability to be Farrokh when he visited his parents. By the late 1970s, Freddie Mercury was a complete construction. The stage presence, the confidence, the theatrical personality that commanded stadiums. But in his parents' Feltham home, Bomi wanted Farrokh. Wanted the quiet boy who'd played piano at St. Peter's School. The son who'd been raised Zoroastrian and understood Parsi traditions. The young man who could sit respectfully with extended family and not dominate every conversation with his outsized personality. Freddie tried, would change clothes before visiting, choosing conservative outfits instead of his usual flamboyance. Would sit quietly while Bomi talked about community news and family updates. Would eat Jer's cooking and compliment it properly. But he couldn't fully compress himself back into the Farrokh shape. The decades of being Freddie Mercury had changed something fundamental. The expansiveness, the need to perform, the way he took up space, it couldn't be completely contained even when he was trying to be the dutiful son. Bomi noticed, would make small comments. You've become very loud, Farrokh. Must you gesture so much when you speak? In our culture, we value humility. Each comment a small rejection of who Freddie had become, each one widening the gap between the son who existed and the son Bomi had expected. Then came the issue of marriage. Mary Austin had been in Freddie's life since 1970. By the mid-1970s, she was effectively his partner, living with him integrated into his life. Jer liked Mary, found her sweet and grounding for her excessive son, but Bomi asked when they would marry, when Freddie would make it official, when there would be a proper Parsi ceremony bringing Mary into the family formally. Freddie deflected. Then the romantic relationship with Mary ended, though their bond continued in ways Bomi found confusing and inappropriate. Why was Freddie still so close to her if they weren't going to marry? Why was he not finding another suitable woman? Why as he approached 30 and then past it, was there no wife, no children, no family being built? Bomi didn't ask directly about Freddie's sexuality, didn't confront the increasingly obvious reality of his son's relationships with men. But his silence on the topic was its own kind of statement. The refusal to acknowledge meant the refusal to accept. Freddie never came out to his father explicitly, never sat him down and said the words, but he stopped hiding, stopped pretending, brought partners to family gatherings occasionally, introducing them as friends, but making the relationship clear through proximity and familiarity. Bomi would greet these men politely, offer tea, make small talk, then never mention them again. Would ask Freddie when he was going to settle down as if the relationships Bomi witnessed didn't count, weren't real, were just another phase of the excessive lifestyle his son had chosen. The 3 a.m. phone call happened in 1985. Queen had just performed Live Aid, the performance that revitalized their career, that reminded the world why they mattered. That gave Freddie one of his greatest professional triumphs. 72,000 people at Wembley Stadium. Nearly 2 billion watching worldwide. 20 minutes that demonstrated Freddie Mercury's absolute command of massive audiences. The performance that would be studied and celebrated for decades. Freddie was in Munich a few days later, still riding the high of Live Aid's success. Unable to sleep, adrenaline and emotion keeping him awake at 3 in the morning in a hotel room. He'd been drinking, not drunk but loosened. And in that state, he did something he almost never did. He called his father. The phone rang and felt him at 3 a.m. London time. Bommy answered, voice heavy with sleep and concern because who calls at this hour except with emergency news? Papa, it's Farrokh. Freddie's voice probably too loud, too emotional. The performance, high still coursing through him. Did you watch Live Aid? Did you see it? Bommy had watched. Jer had insisted they turn on the television. They'd seen their son commanding Wembley Stadium. Watched him move 72,000 people like an orchestra conductor. Yes, we saw it. Bommy's voice careful, waiting to understand where this midnight call was going. And Freddie asking the question he'd been asking in various forms for 20 years. What did you think? The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Freddie wondered if the connection had dropped. Then Bommy spoke. It was very loud. So many people. I hope you're being careful with your voice. That was it. Not you were magnificent. Not I've never seen anything like it. Not I'm proud of you. Just concern about his voice. Practical, parental in the most basic sense. But not the acknowledgement Freddie was calling for at 3 in the morning from a Munich hotel room. That's all you have to say? Freddie's voice probably showing the hurt, the disbelief that even Live Aid couldn't earn the words he needed. I wanted you to know that what you saw, he was trying to explain, trying to make his father understand the magnitude of what had happened, the global impact, the way he'd moved billions of people. Balmy interrupted gently. It's very late, Farrokh. You should sleep. We can talk when you're home. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, ended with formalities. Freddie saying he'd visit soon. Balmy saying to take care of himself. Both saying they loved each other, because that was never in question. But the thing Freddie called for the acknowledgement, the pride without qualifications, the sense that his father finally understood and accepted what he'd become that didn't happen. Freddie told Brian May about the call a few days later. They were in the studio working on new material. Freddie mentioned it casually, but Brian heard the pain underneath. He watched Live Aid. Nearly 2 billion people saw it, and my father's response was concern about my voice. Brian didn't know what to say. How do you comfort someone who's conquered the world but can't win his father's unqualified approval? He loves you, Brian offered. I know he loves me, Freddie snapped. That's not what I need. I need him to... He stopped. Couldn't articulate what he needed because it was so simple and so impossible. He needed Bommy to say, what you've done is extraordinary. I was wrong to doubt you. I'm proud of the choices you made. But Bommy couldn't say those things. To say them would be to reject his own values, his own understanding of what made life worthwhile. How could he celebrate a career built on everything Parsi tradition taught you to avoid? How could he take pride in the theatrical excess, the public spectacle, the lifestyle that violated every principle of modest respectability? Bommy loved his son, but loving someone and being proud of their choices are different things. And Bommy couldn't reconcile Freddie Mercury's success with Farrokh Bulsara's obligations. The relationship continued in this strained state for the next 6 years. Freddie visited his parents regularly, especially his mother Jer, who he adored and who accepted him more completely than Bommy ever could. He bought them things, a better house and a nicer part of Feltham, though Bommy initially refused, saying he didn't need his son's charity and only accepted when Jer insisted they were getting too old for the stairs in their current home. He provided financial security, which Bommy accepted as a father's rightful due from a successful son, but never acknowledged as generosity or sacrifice. The emotional distance remained like a wall neither could dismantle. They had pleasant conversations about safe topics. Jer's health, the garden, news from the Parsi community, whether Freddie was eating properly. They avoided discussing Freddie's personal life, his relationships, the full reality of who he was and how he lived. They maintained a surface relationship that allowed them to function as family without ever addressing the fundamental gap between them, the ocean of unspoken truths that grew wider each year. When Freddie was diagnosed with AIDS in 1987, he didn't tell Bommy, told almost no one, but especially not his father. How could he explain this disease, This thing that would confirm every fear Bommy had harbored about the lifestyle Freddie had chosen. How could he have that conversation when they'd spent decades never having honest conversations about his sexuality, his relationships, the full truth of his existence? The words didn't exist between them for that kind of honesty. Jer knew eventually. Mothers always know. She saw her son deteriorating, the weight loss, the exhaustion, the way he moved like someone whose body was betraying him, and understood even before he confirmed it in a quiet conversation where they both cried, and she held him like she'd held the 7-year-old Farrokh leaving for boarding school. But Balmy either didn't allow himself to see or successfully avoided acknowledging what was becoming obvious to everyone else. Even when Freddie's appearance changed dramatically, when the weight loss became impossible to ignore, when the man who'd commanded Wembley Stadium could barely walk up the stairs to his parents' home, Balmy treated it like any other health concern. Asked if Freddie was seeing doctors, getting proper treatment, if he needed anything, but didn't ask the real questions because the answers would require acknowledging truths they'd spent decades carefully not discussing. Freddie's last visit to his parents' home was in early November 1991. He was very ill but still mobile, though it took enormous effort, still maintaining the fiction that this was manageable, that he'd recover, that death wasn't standing in the doorway waiting. He sat with Balmy in the same living room where they'd had that conversation 25 years earlier about giving up music and choosing a respectable career. Balmy was in his early 70s now, still formal, still proper, maintaining the Parsi dignity that had defined his life. But age had softened some of the rigidity. He looked at his son so thin, so obviously failing, skin stretched over bones, eyes enormous in his wasting face, and for a moment seemed about to say something real. Something that acknowledged the truth of what was happening and what had happened over the past 40 years of distance and disappointment and love that couldn't find words. Freddie waited, barely breathing, hoping that maybe now, maybe finally, his father would say what he'd spent his entire life needing to hear. But Balmy just patted his hand gently and asked if he'd eaten enough, if Jer had made sure he'd had proper food, if the doctors were giving him good care. The moment passed like all the others had passed. The words stayed unspoken. When Freddie left that day, hugging his mother longer than usual, holding her tight enough that she understood this might be goodbye, though neither said it, Balmy stood in the doorway watching. Jer said later that after Freddie's car disappeared down the street, Balmy stood in that doorway for several minutes before coming back inside. That he sat down heavily in his chair and said quietly, "He's not going to get better, is he?" It wasn't really a question. Jer didn't answer. They both knew. They sat in silence, holding hands, while the afternoon light faded and the truth they couldn't speak settled over them like dust.